I stood on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind biting at my face, holding the thick manila envelope that confirmed it. Case dismissed. My case. My revenge. The HOA board members were still inside the building, their lawyer red-faced and stammering. They had dragged me through 6 months of legal threats, letters, and meetings over what they called a non-compliant mailbox at my lake cabin. A $500 mailbox, mind you. One I had personally chosen because it matched the rustic wood style of my cabin and had been there for years without a single complaint. But then a new HOA president, Sandra Lowe, who I now lovingly refer to as Karen in hiking boots, decided it destroyed the neighborhood's aesthetic and demanded I replace it. When I refused, they sued me. Over a mailbox. I didn't just fight back. I obliterated them. And I wasn't standing here smiling because I just won my case. I was smiling because what they didn't know yet, what they were about to find out, was that in the process of fighting them, I had spent $35,000 of my own money on something that would make sure they'd never forget me for as long as they lived in that neighborhood. When the double doors opened, the board members came out, chattering angrily. I caught Sandra's glare. She tried to give me one of her cold, self-satisfied smiles, but mine was wider, calmer, like someone who knew the ending of a movie she hadn't seen yet. And then she saw the man standing behind me, holding a rolled-up set of blueprints. Her fake smile faltered. "What's that?" she asked. I didn't answer. I just let my grin deepen, turned my back, and walked toward my truck. That was the exact moment the plan I had been cooking for months was about to move from paper to reality. And the best part? It all started because I didn't replace a stupid mailbox. The beginning of this whole mess goes back about 9 months. I had bought the lake cabin 5 years earlier, as a little getaway from my main home in the city. It wasn't a mansion or anything fancy, just a 2-bedroom wooden cabin on half an acre surrounded by pine trees with a small dock out front. It was my happy place. The cabin sat in a neighborhood with about 40 homes, most of them seasonal vacation spots, and yes, unfortunately, it had an HOA. When I first moved in, the HOA was more like a group of retirees who cared about lawn mowing schedules and making sure no one left trash cans out too long. They left me alone because I kept my property neat and paid my dues on time. That changed when Sandra moved in. Sandra Lowe was in her late 40s, newly divorced, and had the kind of permanent scowl that could sour milk. Within 6 months, she was elected HOA president because no one else wanted the job, and immediately began sending out violation notices like she was running a military base. She didn't like my cabin's wooden mailbox, said it was unapproved, and didn't match the HOA's uniform style. I laughed when I read the letter and tossed it in the trash. The next month, she sent another letter, this time threatening fines of $50 a day until I replaced it with a standard HOA-approved model. I sent her a polite email back explaining that my mailbox was sturdy, functional, and had been in place since before I bought the cabin. I even attached photos showing that at least 5 other houses had non-standard mailboxes. 2 days later, I received an official notice. I was being fined $500 and given 30 days to comply. That's when I decided to fight. Now, I could have just paid the fine or quietly swapped the mailbox and avoided the hassle. That's what most people would do. But something about Sandra's tone in her emails, something about the way she singled me out, made my blood boil. It wasn't about the mailbox anymore. It was about principle. I attended the next HOA meeting. It was held in the community lodge, a small wooden building with a fireplace and folding chairs. Sandra sat at the front like she was chairing a Senate hearing, surrounded by her little board of 3 members. I calmly explained why I wasn't replacing my mailbox and pointed out the others that didn't match the HOA's approved design. Sandra didn't even look at me while I spoke. She just shuffled papers, then said, "This matter has been decided." The next week I was served court papers. They were suing me for failure to comply with community standards and damaging neighborhood property values. I remember standing in my kitchen with the papers in my hand thinking, they really think they can bully me into this. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The lawsuit dragged on for months. I hired a lawyer, gathered evidence, took photos of every single non-compliant mailbox in the neighborhood, and even tracked down the original developer of the community, who confirmed there had never been a strict mailbox rule when it was first built. Sandra kept pushing, though. She wanted to make an example out of me. But here's where it gets good. Because somewhere in the middle of all that, I got an idea. One of the key arguments Sandra kept making was that my mailbox distracted from the beauty and value of the neighborhood. She even brought in an appraiser to say my cabin's value might be lower because of it. That's when it hit me. If she cared so much about property values, what would happen if I made a perfectly legal change to my property that really got under her skin? I started researching, calling surveyors, pulling county zoning maps. And then I found it. A loophole in the HOA's own charter. buried in Section 14, Paragraph C. It basically stated that any community property touching private lots, but not explicitly owned by the HOA, could be purchased or leased by the adjoining property owner, without the HOA's approval. And guess what was touching the edge of my cabin's lot? The community's private entrance road. I won't give away all the details yet, but let's just say my $35,000 investment was going to make Sandra regret ever writing that first violation notice. When the day finally came, and I walked out of that courthouse with the case dismissed, I knew the fun was only beginning, because the next step, well, let's just say the whole neighborhood was about to have to deal with me every single day, whether they liked it or not. Before we move forward, let me introduce the main characters in this story so you can picture them in your head. Me, Mike Harper, 48, part-time cabin dweller, lover of peace and fishing, allergic to bullies. Sandra Lowe, HOA president, late 40s, newly divorced, permanently annoyed at the world, lives to micromanage others. Tom Jenkins, my neighbor 2 houses down, mid-60s, retired mechanic, the kind of guy who can fix anything with duct tape and a beer in hand. Also, my ally in this fight. Rachel Kim, my lawyer, early 30s, smart as a whip, doesn't take crap from anyone. Bill and Patty Evans, elderly couple who've lived in the neighborhood for 30-plus years. Sweet folks who got fined for having too many potted plants on their porch. So, where are you watching from? I'd love to know before we dive into what happened when I pulled the trigger on my $35,000 plan, because that's when this whole thing went from annoying to legendary. And trust me, the next move made Sandra lose her mind. The next morning after the court case, I woke up at my cabin with a coffee in hand, staring out over the mist-covered lake. It was quiet, the kind of peace you could bottle up and sell, if you could keep the HOA from spoiling it. But as I sat there sipping slowly, I kept replaying Sandra's face from yesterday. That tight-lipped fake smile faltering when she saw the man with my blueprints. It was burned into my memory, and I'll be honest, I enjoyed it a little too much. I knew the fight wasn't over. Sure, the case about the mailbox was dismissed, but I also knew people like Sandra didn't just roll over and go away. No, they doubled down. They schemed. They found new ways to make your life miserable, which was exactly why I was already 3 steps ahead. I put my coffee down and unrolled the blueprints on the dining table. They were for a small structure, nothing crazy, that I planned to build right on the strip of land I'd legally acquired during the lawsuit preparations. The strip wasn't big, but its location was everything. It was the first 10 feet of the community's only paved entrance road. Let me explain how that happened. During my digging for legal ammunition, I stumbled on old county land surveys from before the HOA even existed. Apparently, when the original developer built the neighborhood, he left a weird sliver of land unclaimed between my property and the main road. For years, everyone just assumed it belonged to the HOA. But in reality, the county record showed it as unincorporated parcel with no assigned ownership. Thanks to that tiny loophole in the HOA charter, I could apply to purchase or lease it from the county without their approval, as long as it was for personal use. So I did. I paid a surveyor, hired a real estate lawyer, and in just under 6 weeks that strip of land was legally mine. And here's where it got fun. That strip of land wasn't just sitting there doing nothing. It happened to be the exact point where the community's private entrance road connected to the main public road. Meaning, if I wanted to, I could control it. Now, I wasn't planning to be petty about it. At least not at first. I had an idea for a small, rustic, welcome to the lake-style gatehouse. Maybe a cute archway, some landscaping, even a community bulletin board. All perfectly legal. But I also knew Sandra well enough to know she would absolutely lose it when she found out she couldn't stop me from building it, especially since it would be the first thing every car had to drive under to get in or out of the neighborhood. And once she lost her mind, she'd probably say or do something that gave me even more leverage. But before I could get to that delicious moment, I had to make sure I was bulletproof. That meant permits, inspections, paperwork, all done by the book. If Sandra was going to try and fight me, she'd have to fight the county too. 2 weeks later, I had everything approved. The building materials were ordered, the crew was scheduled, and the only thing left was to tell my immediate neighbors, Tom Jenkins being the first. I walked over to his place one afternoon, knocking on the door. He opened it with a wrench in one hand and the smell of motor oil drifting out from his garage. "Mike," he grinned, wiping his hands on a rag. "Heard you won your case. Figured you'd be out celebrating." "Oh, I'm celebrating all right," I said, just in a different way. "You got a minute?" We sat in his garage sipping beers while I explained the whole thing. His eyes got wider with every detail. By the time I was done, he was practically wheezing from laughter. "You're telling me," he said between chuckles, "that you own the front door to the whole neighborhood now?" "Pretty much." "And Sandra can't stop you?" "Not unless she can rewrite county land law," I smirked. He sat back grinning, Mike, you're my hero. The next week was calm, almost unnervingly so. I worked on my cabin, did some fishing, and even ran into Bill and Patty Evans at the local diner. They'd heard about my court win and congratulated me, but they also warned me. Be careful, Mike, Patty said, leaning in like she was sharing a secret. Sandra doesn't take embarrassment well. She's going to come after you harder. Oh, I'm counting on it, I replied, trying to keep my tone light. What I didn't realize then was just how quickly her coming after me would happen, and how messy it would get. The first sign came 3 days before the construction crew was scheduled to start. I woke up to the sound of voices outside. When I looked out the window, I saw Sandra and 2 of her board members standing at the edge of my driveway, pointing toward the strip of land. She had a clipboard in one hand and was taking photos with her phone. I stepped outside, keeping my coffee mug in hand like I wasn't the least bit bothered. Morning, I called. She gave me a thin smile. We're just inspecting community property. Pretty sure that's my property, I said. Her smile tightened. It's part of the community's access road. It falls under HOA jurisdiction. Not according to the county records, I replied, sipping my coffee. She narrowed her eyes. We'll see about that. Then she turned on her heel and walked away. That afternoon, I got an email from the HOA claiming I was attempting to alter community property without approval and demanding that I cease any construction plans. I forwarded it straight to my lawyer, Rachel, who called me within an hour. Mike, they're trying to bait you, she said. They don't have a legal leg to stand on, but if you respond emotionally, they'll use it against you. So what do? Nothing, she said. Let them squirm. We start building on Monday like planned. And that's exactly what I did. Monday morning came and so did the crew. By 8 a.m., the sound of power tools echoed through the entrance road. A delivery truck dropped off lumber, concrete mix, and a big sign that read, "Coming soon, Harbor Lake, Welcome Gatehouse." By 10 a.m., Sandra was back, this time with her phone out, filming everything. She marched up to the foreman, demanding to see permits. He calmly pointed her to the laminated county approvals we'd posted on the worksite fence. Her face turned red. She spun around to me, who was leaning on my truck watching the whole thing, and snapped, "This isn't over." I know, I said with a grin. It's just getting started. For the rest of the day, she paced back and forth like a caged animal, making phone calls and gesturing wildly toward the crew. By sunset, the frame of the gatehouse was already taking shape, and I could practically see steam coming out of her ears. That night, I sat on my porch with Tom, watching the glow of the work lights at the entrance. You know she's going to try something drastic, he said. I'm counting on it, I replied, and as if the universe wanted to prove me right, the drastic thing happened the very next morning. At 6 a.m. I was woken by the sound of shouting. I threw on a jacket and went outside to see what was happening, only to find 2 sheriff's deputies parked at the entrance road. Sandra was there too, waving her arms and pointing at the gatehouse frame. She was claiming it was blocking emergency access and needed to be torn down immediately. One of the deputies approached me. Sir, we've had a complaint about construction blocking the roadway. I pointed to the clear path where any vehicle could still pass easily. As you can see, the road's not blocked, and here are the county permits. The deputy looked them over, nodded, and turned back to Sandra. Ma'am, everything appears to be in order here. Sandra's face was priceless. She'd called the cops on me and it had backfired spectacularly. But I knew this wasn't the end of her tricks. If anything, it was just the opening act. And sure enough, by that evening, she made her boldest move yet. Because when I went to bed that night, the gatehouse frame was standing tall. But when I woke up the next morning, it was gone. Completely torn down. I stood there barefoot in the cold morning air, staring at the empty patch of gravel where my gatehouse frame had been just 12 hours earlier. It wasn't vandalism. It wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. The posts had been yanked out of the ground, the lumber stacked neatly off to the side, and my "coming soon" sign was lying face down in the mud. Whoever did this didn't just knock it over, they dismantled it with tools, and I didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out who was behind it. Sandra Lowe had finally crossed the line. Tom must have seen me from his kitchen window because 5 minutes later, he was walking down my driveway, coffee in hand, wearing that I already know look on his face. They hit you, huh? He said, nodding toward the empty space. Yeah, I replied, my voice tight. At night. And they didn't even try to hide it. Gotta be Sandra, he said without hesitation. She's the only one with the nerve and the pettiness to do something like this. Oh, I'm sure it was her, I said. The question is, do I call the cops, or do I make this a bigger problem for her than she can handle? Tom smirked. Knowing you, you've already got a plan. He wasn't wrong. Before I called the sheriff, I pulled out my phone and texted Rachel, my lawyer. Me. Sandra had the gatehouse dismantled overnight. Legal grounds? Rachel, that's destruction of private property. File a police report ASAP. And don't touch anything. Photograph everything first. So I did exactly that. I took over 50 pictures from every angle, close-ups of the cut bolts, the tire tracks in the dirt, even the broken lock on my supply shed. Whoever did it had been in a hurry, but they'd left plenty of evidence. Then I called the sheriff's office. Within the hour, a deputy arrived, took one look at the scene, and started making notes. Any idea who might have done this? He asked. I didn't hesitate. Sandra Lowe, HOA president. She's been harassing me for months over this project. He raised an eyebrow. You got proof? Not yet, I said. But I've got something better. Cameras. What Sandra didn't know was that 3 days before construction started, I'd installed a set of motion-activated trail cameras in the trees around the gatehouse site. They were hidden well. Just small black boxes strapped to trunks, barely visible. I pulled one down, popped out the SD card, and handed it to the deputy. An hour later, I got a call from him. You're gonna want to come down to the station, he said. We pulled the footage. It's pretty clear. When I arrived, he loaded the video on his computer. And there it was, crystal clear night vision footage of Sandra herself, in a hoodie and jeans, directing two men as they dismantled the gatehouse. One of them was even wearing an HOA volunteer badge around his neck. Sandra wasn't just involved, she was leading the charge. Rachel's voice in my head was calm and sharp. Don't react. Use this. So I didn't storm over to her house. I didn't post it on the neighborhood Facebook group. I stayed quiet, while Rachel filed an official criminal complaint for property destruction and trespassing. And here's where Sandra made her second mistake. Instead of lying low, she doubled down. The very next day, I received another HOA letter, this time threatening to fine me $1,000 for obstruction of community access, and warning that my membership privileges could be revoked. I almost laughed out loud. She had no idea I had video evidence that could get her arrested. That night, I had Tom over again, and we sat on my porch going over the footage like we were planning a military operation. You're not just going to hand this over to the sheriff and be done with it, are you? He asked. Nope, I said. I'm going to let this sit for a week, let her think she's won. And in the meantime, I'm going to order double the materials and hire a bigger crew. This time we're building something she can't tear down without a crane. And a court order. Tom grinned. You're evil. I prefer motivated. The next week was almost comically tense. Sandra avoided eye contact whenever she drove past my cabin, but I could see her watching from her front porch whenever I went to get the mail. Then on Friday morning, 2 county trucks showed up at the entrance road. Sandra came strutting down the driveway like she'd summoned them herself, but when the county inspector got out, he walked straight to me. Mr. Harper? He asked. That's me. He handed me a clipboard. Just here to confirm your updated building permits. Sandra's smile died on the spot. The new blueprints weren't just for the original gatehouse. They included a widened entry, reinforced stone columns, and, this was my favorite part, a locking gate system with keypad entry. All completely legal. Sandra finally cracked. You can't just put up a gate, that's against HOA bylaws, she shouted. The inspector turned to her, deadpan. Ma'am, this is county property now. Your HOA has no authority here. I wish I could have bottled the look on her face. By Monday, the construction crew was back and the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Neighbors slowed their cars to gawk at the massive stone columns going up. Sandra didn't come outside, but I knew she was plotting something. And I didn't have to wait long to find out what. Because on Wednesday morning, as I walked down to check the progress, I saw a big, bold sign planted right in the middle of my gravel. Notice of pending civil action. Stop work immediately. It was printed on HOA letterhead. The problem for Sandra? She just made her third and biggest mistake yet. Because by placing that sign on my legally owned property, she just handed me the perfect reason to file a restraining order against her and the entire HOA board. And I was more than ready to use it. I didn't waste any time. That same morning, I took photos of the HOA's big ugly stop work sign, pulled it out of the ground and drove straight to Rachel's office. She was sitting at her desk, reading over a stack of papers when I walked in. I dropped the sign onto her desk like it was a trophy. Tell me we can bury them with this, I said. Rachel looked it over, smirked, and said, Oh, Mike, this isn't just a nail in their coffin. This is the hammer. By placing that notice on my land that the county recognized as mine, Sandra and her board had crossed into harassment territory. They had already been documented trespassing and destroying my property. Now, they were interfering with an approved construction project in violation of multiple county statutes. Rachel leaned back in her chair. We're filing for a restraining order today, against the entire HOA board, not just Sandra. I grinned. Can we make it so they can't even walk onto my property? She raised an eyebrow. We can make it so if they step 1 foot past your lot line, they'll be arrested for contempt of court. Perfect, I said. The paperwork moved fast. Faster than I expected. Within 48 hours, we had a temporary restraining order in place. A hearing for a permanent one was set for the following week. And when the deputy served Sandra the papers on her front porch, I happened to be sitting on mine with a cup of coffee. She opened the door, took the envelope, read the first page, and turned bright red. She looked up at me, fists clenched, but couldn't say a word. Instead, she slammed the door so hard the windows rattled. The beauty of the restraining order was that it didn't just protect me. It froze her ability to interfere with the construction. The crew worked uninterrupted for the first time in weeks. By Friday, the stone columns were done, the wooden gate beams were in place, and the keypad system was being installed. The project looked monumental, a real entrance, solid and permanent. Neighbors started coming by to compliment it. Even people who usually stayed out of HOA drama were saying, "It looks great, Mike. Way better than what we had before." Tom, of course, loved stirring the pot. "Every car that drives in here now will have to pass under your gate," he said one evening. Sandra must be losing her mind. I chuckled. Oh, she's losing more than that. But the real fun started at the restraining order hearing. Sandra showed up in a beige pantsuit, lips pressed into a thin line, flanked by the other 3 HOA board members. They looked like they were marching into battle. Rachel leaned over to me and whispered, "Let them talk first." And boy, did they. Sandra ranted for nearly 10 minutes about community integrity, unlawful obstruction, and how I was creating division. Then Rachel stood up, clicked a remote, and played the night vision footage from my trail cameras, the one showing Sandra herself tearing down my first gatehouse in the dead of night. The courtroom went silent. Sandra's mouth actually dropped open. Rachel let the video play all the way through before saying, "Your Honor, this is the HOA president accusing my client of obstruction, while she herself committed property destruction. The land in question is privately owned, as verified by county records. Their harassment has been documented multiple times. We request a permanent restraining order to protect my client and his right to enjoy his property without interference." The judge didn't hesitate. Granted. Effective immediately. When we walked out of the courthouse, Sandra couldn't even look at me. One of her board members peeled away and muttered, "This has gone too far, Sandra," before getting into his car. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The next week the gate was finished. Solid cedar beams, reinforced hinges, keypad entry, and a beautiful carved wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Harbor Lake. Private entry." I installed a small plaque at the base of the column, "Property of Mike Harper, all rights reserved." From that day forward, if you wanted to get in or out of the neighborhood, you had to pass through my gate, and that meant you were stepping onto my property. And here's the kicker. Because it was private land, I could set the terms of access. The county required I allow reasonable passage for residents and emergency services. But reasonable left a lot of room for interpretation. Sandra had no idea that her worst nightmare was about to get worse. One crisp Saturday morning, as I was cleaning my boat, Sandra drove up to the gate and punched in the code. It didn't work. She tried again. Still nothing. I walked over slowly. "Morning, Sandra. Need help?" "This keypad isn't working," she snapped. "Oh, I changed the code yesterday," I said casually. "Sent the new one out to everyone who's on my approved access list." Her face tightened. "I didn't get it." "That's because you're not on the list yet," I replied. "The restraining order means you can't come onto my property without permission, so you'll need to email me a request for access, and I'll consider it." "You can't do that," she shouted. "Actually," I said, pointing to the plaque, "I can." She sat there, seething, before throwing her car into reverse and speeding away. Tom thought it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "You've got the HOA president locked out of her own neighborhood unless she asks you nicely. Mike, you're a legend." I shrugged. "It's just the beginning." Because while the gate was a power move, my $35,000 plan wasn't finished yet. The second phase was already in motion, one that would make sure Sandra and her crew would think twice before messing with anyone again. And it involved the one thing the HOA feared more than me: the county tax assessor's office. The day after my little access code moment with Sandra, I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee, my laptop open, and a folder full of county documents spread out in front of me. This wasn't just casual browsing. This was surgical planning. I'd spent the past few weeks quietly collecting every scrap of information I could about the HOA's operations. Not just the public stuff, the minutes from meetings, their published rules, and their financial statements, but also the structural backbone of the community, property lines, zoning maps, and the original developer plats from decades ago. Why? Because the HOA's true power didn't come from barking about mailboxes or fining people over weeds. It came from their control over shared spaces. Roads, walking trails, the dock, the little strip of picnic area by the lake. Those weren't individually owned. They were common property, held in the HOA's name. And if I could find any part of that common property that wasn't legally secured, I could take it. Here's how I approached it. First, I mapped the entire neighborhood using the county's GIS system, an online tool that lets you click on any plot of land and see the ownership records. Most parcels were clearly marked as Harbor Lake HOA, Inc. But as I zoomed in near the lakefront, I noticed something odd. A thin, jagged strip of land along the shoreline had no listed owner. It wasn't part of any homeowner's lot, and it wasn't officially under the HOA's name either. It was labeled Public Utility Easement, unassigned. That immediately got my attention. Now, a utility easement usually means a space reserved for things like power lines, water pipes, or drainage, but in this case it was unused. No poles, no pipes, just an overgrown, narrow path running behind the lakeside homes and right up to the community's boat dock. If the HOA didn't own it and the county hadn't designated it for anything, that meant it was fair game for private lease or purchase, just like the strip of land at the entrance road I'd already acquired. The boat dock was the HOA's pride and joy. It was one of the only real amenities they had to justify their yearly dues. If I controlled the only legal land access to that dock, I could essentially decide who got to use it. The next step was making sure I could secure it without tipping off Sandra or the board. I drove down to the county assessor's office, a nondescript brick building with dusty windows and the smell of old paper lingering in the air. Inside, I spoke to a clerk named Harold, a man in his late 60s with reading glasses perched halfway down his nose and a dry sense of humor. When I asked about the shoreline easement, he flipped through a giant ledger, cross-referenced a few files, and then looked up at me. "Well," he said slowly, "this section here was never transferred to the HOA. Legally, it's still unclaimed. And under county policy, if you're an adjacent property owner or have documented interest in the community, you can apply to lease or buy it." I leaned in. "And what happens if I buy it?" He smiled faintly. "Then anyone who wants to cross it to get to that dock will need your permission." The application process wasn't simple. I had to provide surveys, prove that acquiring the land wouldn't block public safety access, and submit a proposed use plan. That last part was where I got creative. I wrote up a plan for a private fishing and recreation area that included benches, small gardens, and better dock maintenance. All very wholesome, very inoffensive, on paper. 3 weeks later, the county approved it. I paid just under $12,000 for the lease rights, renewable every 5 years. Sandra had no clue. I kept quiet about it while I finished the gatehouse project. Neighbors came and went, and life seemed to settle into a strange new normal. People still whispered about the lawsuit, the restraining order, and Sandra's meltdown, but outwardly, things calmed down. Until the HOA's annual Lake Day. Lake Day was their big summer event. Food, music, kids swimming, everyone using the dock. It was Sandra's moment to play queen of the neighborhood. The morning of the event, I parked my truck in front of the new path entrance and hung a wooden sign that read, "Private property, access by permission only" underneath, in smaller print. "For access, please contact Mike Harper." I was sitting in a folding chair by the path, sipping lemonade, when the first wave of confused residents arrived, picnic baskets in hand. "Mike, what's this about?" one woman asked, frowning at the sign. "Oh, just some new property rules," I said cheerfully. "County records will show it's now part of my lease. You're welcome to use it. Just need you to sign a liability waiver first." Most people didn't care. They signed and went on their way. But word travels fast, and within 30 minutes, Sandra herself came storming down the hill in a wide-brimmed sun hat and an expression that could curdle milk. "What is this?" she demanded, gesturing at the sign. "It's exactly what it says," I replied. "This strip of land is mine now. You'll need my permission to get to the dock." "That dock is HOA property," she snapped. "Sure is," I said, "but the only legal land access to it now runs across my property, which means without my permission, nobody gets to use it." Her jaw literally dropped. "You can't." "I can," I said, pulling a folded document from my pocket. "County lease agreement signed and sealed." She snatched it from my hand, skimmed it, and I swear I thought she might faint. That afternoon, half the HOA board was crowded around Sandra on the dock, whispering furiously while residents enjoyed themselves anyway. They knew exactly what this meant. The HOA could no longer guarantee free dock access as part of their amenities package. And if they couldn't guarantee that, They'd have a hard time justifying the $600 annual dues they charged every homeowner. I just cut them off at the knees. That night, Tom came over grinning from ear to ear. "Mike, you've got them cornered. If they want to keep that dock as a selling point, they're going to have to deal with you on your terms." I nodded. And I'm not done yet. This was phase 2. Phase 3 is going to hit them where it really hurts. Their bank account. Because in my next move, I wasn't just going to control access to their dock. I was going to make it so every time they wanted to use it for an event, they'd have to pay me for the privilege. 2 weeks after Lake Day, the HOA sent out their monthly newsletter. Normally, I tossed it in the trash without a second glance, but this time the headline caught my eye. Upcoming events at Harbor Lake. Join us for Dockside Movie Night. I almost choked on my coffee. Dockside Movie Night? On my land? The HOA was really going to try to hold a community event using the dock without even asking me. Bold. Or stupid. Probably both. I set the newsletter down and started smiling. This was the opening I'd been waiting for. That afternoon I typed up a simple letter on my computer. To Harbor Lake HOA Board, from Mike Harper. Subject, dock access fees. As of July 1st, 20XX, the strip of land providing access to the Harbor Lake Community Dock is under my legal lease from the county. Any events organized by the HOA that require dock access must have prior written approval from me and will incur a rental fee of $250 per event day. Failure to secure written approval before the event date will result in the dock being physically inaccessible for the duration of the unapproved event. Thank you for your understanding. Sincerely, Mike Harper. I printed 10 copies, signed each one, and hand-delivered them, one to each HOA board member's mailbox. And yes, I made sure Sandra's was the first to get it. 3 days later, I got the response I expected. Sandra emailed me in all caps. "This is outrageous. You have no right to charge the HOA for access to its own dock. Expect legal action." I didn't reply. Instead, I emailed Rachel, my lawyer. "Forwarding this to you for the file. Looks like they'll be holding a dock event without permission. Can we block it?" Rachel called me within minutes. "You can absolutely block it, Mike. As long as you don't physically endanger anyone, you're within your rights to restrict access to your leased land. Just make sure you document everything." On the night of the movie event, I made sure to be ready. At 5 p.m., 3 hours before showtime, I parked my truck sideways across the path entrance and locked a heavy-duty chain between the 2 posts on either side. Then I hung a fresh sign. "Private event tonight. No access without written permission." And just for good measure, I sat in my folding chair nearby, sipping lemonade like I had all the time in the world. Around 6:30, the first group of residents arrived. Kids with blankets, parents carrying coolers. They stopped short at the chain, looking confused. "Sorry, folks," I said with a polite smile. "The HOA didn't get permission for this event, so the dock's closed for tonight." Some people grumbled, some turned around, but a few stayed, pulling out their phones to text Sandra. 10 minutes later, here she came, marching down the path in a Harbor Lake t-shirt and visor, a rolled-up movie poster in one hand. "Move your truck, Mike," she barked. "No can do," I replied calmly. "You didn't reserve the dock through me. You know the rules." "This is harassment," she spat. "This is a business arrangement," I said. "If the HOA wants dock access for events, they pay like anyone else." She tried to argue, but I didn't budge. Eventually, she stomped back up the hill, her little crowd of loyal board members trailing after her. The next morning, my email pinged with a message from the HOA treasurer. "Mike, while we don't agree with your position, the board voted to approve payment for future events to avoid disruption. Expect a check for $250 for next month's fishing derby." And just like that, I had turned the HOA's prized possession into my own rental income stream. But Sandra wasn't done. She might have lost the battle over the gate, the dock, and the restraining order, but she still had one weapon left: rumors. Over the next few weeks, she started whispering to neighbors that I was ruining the community spirit, and only out for myself. I heard from Bill and Patty Evans that she'd even told people I planned to start charging residents individually to use the dock for fishing. That wasn't true. Yet. But hearing it gave me an idea. If Sandra wanted to paint me as the villain, maybe I'd lean into the role. Just enough to make her regret pushing me there. One quiet Sunday morning, I pulled up the lease agreement and reread the section about access. It said I had to allow reasonable access for residents, but didn't define what that meant. I decided reasonable could mean scheduled appointments. So I posted a new sign. Dock access hours, 9 a.m., 5 p.m. All users must sign in with Mike Harper prior to entry. That meant if someone wanted to use the dock at sunrise for fishing or at night for a moonlit swim, they'd have to knock on my door. And yes, I'd be keeping a log. Within a week, half the neighborhood was signing my clipboard, and I had a running tally of exactly who used the dock and when. But there was one person who never signed the sheet, never came to me for access, and never set foot near the dock again. Sandra. Which was why, when the county tax assessor's office sent me a letter 2 months later, I knew exactly how to use it. The letter explained that the HOA's amenities value had been reduced because they no longer had guaranteed public access to the dock. That meant the HOA's common property assessment had dropped, along with their justification for high annual dues. If I made this letter public, it would shatter what little control Sandra had left. The letter from the county tax assessor was only 2 pages long, but it was a wrecking ball aimed straight at Sandra's precious HOA throne. I read it 3 times just to savor the words. Due to restricted access to the Harbor Lake dock, the fair market value of said amenity has been reassessed. Effective immediately, the Harbor Lake HOA will see a reduction in taxable value for the dock and adjoining property. This may also affect justifications for HOA dues tied to this amenity. Translation: the HOA had just lost one of its main reasons for charging homeowners $600 a year, and everyone in the neighborhood was going to know about it, because I was going to make sure they saw this letter. I scanned it, printed 20 copies, and walked the neighborhood like I was delivering Christmas cards. I didn't skip a single house. When neighbors opened the door, I handed them the paper with a friendly smile. Just thought you should know what the county thinks about the HOA's dock situation. The reactions were delicious. Bill Evans squinted at it, then muttered, "So they've been charging us for something they don't even fully control?" Patty gasped. I knew she was overcharging. One guy down the road, a younger resident named Mark, actually laughed. Oh, this is going to start a fire. By evening, I could see groups of neighbors gathered in driveways, papers in hand, whispering and pointing toward Sandra's house. The HOA board's phones must have been lighting up like Christmas trees. At around 7 p.m. my phone rang. It was Tom, and he was barely holding back laughter. "You're not going to believe this," he said. "Sandra just called an emergency HOA meeting for tomorrow night. Says it's mandatory for all residents." "Perfect," I said. "I'll be there." The meeting was held at the community lodge, same as always. By the time I arrived, the place was packed. Every folding chair filled, people standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension. Sandra sat at the front table, flanked by the remaining 2 loyal board members. She had a stack of papers in front of her, and that same tight-lipped smile she wore when she thought she still had control. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, voice sugar-coated but strained. "There's been some misinformation circulating about our community amenities, and I want to address it directly." She launched into a long, winding speech about misinterpretations, temporary setbacks, and how the HOA was actively working to restore full dock access. She tried to make it sound like I was just a troublemaker blowing things out of proportion. When she finally paused for breath, I raised my hand. "Mike, we're not taking questions yet," she started. "I'm not asking a question," I said, standing. "I'm making a statement." And I brought proof. From my jacket pocket, I pulled out the original letter from the tax assessor, the one with the official seal and signature. I held it up so everyone could see. "This isn't misinformation," I said loudly. "This is from the county. The dock value has been reduced because the HOA doesn't control access anymore. And the only reason you don't control it is because your president decided to tear down my legally permitted gatehouse in the middle of the night, trespass on my property, and lose in court." The room erupted in murmurs and gasps. Sandra's face went pale, then red. "That's not true?" I cut in. "I have video of you doing it. The sheriff's office has it too. You want me to play it for everyone here?" The murmurs turned into outright chatter now, with people shifting in their seats, whispering to each other. One man in the back shouted, "Let's see it." I looked around the room. "I'm not here to fight with everyone, but you should know your dues are paying for lawsuits, fines, and petty vendettas instead of improvements to the neighborhood. And if you're wondering why your HOA has less power these days, you're looking at the reason." I pointed straight at Sandra. That was the spark. A woman in the second row stood up and said, "I've been fined 3 times for flower pots, 3 times. And now I find out this is what our board has been doing." Another man spoke up. "You lied to us, Sandra. You said the gate was illegal." Within minutes, it was chaos. Voices overlapping, people yelling, some demanding her resignation on the spot. Sandra tried to gavel the meeting back to order, but her voice was drowned out. I just stood there letting the storm I'd started rage on its own. Finally, one of the board members leaned over to her and whispered something. Sandra's lips tightened, and she abruptly stood. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, slamming the gavel and storming out. By the time I got back to my cabin, my phone was buzzing with texts from neighbors thanking me for exposing the truth. A few even offered to help with my gatehouse landscaping in solidarity. But the best message came from an unknown number. Board vote scheduled for next week. Sandra's presidency is hanging by a thread. Thought you'd like to know. I leaned back in my chair, smiling to myself. Phase 4 of my plan was unfolding without me having to lift a finger. Still, I wasn't going to leave it to chance. I had one more card to play. Something that would ensure Sandra not only lost her position, but would never get close to HOA power again. It involved her own words, a recording device, and a conversation I knew she couldn't resist having. If there's one thing I'd learned about Sandra over the past year, it's that she couldn't resist the urge to control the narrative. If people started talking against her, she had to step in and set the record straight, which usually meant doubling down on her lies or slipping up out of pure arrogance. And I was about to use that weakness like a fishing hook. 2 days after the chaotic HOA meeting, I called Tom. "You still got that little voice recorder you use for fishing guides?" I asked. "Yeah, why?" "I need it." He paused. "Oh, this is gonna be good." The plan was simple. I'd bump into Sandra somewhere neutral, somewhere she'd feel like she could talk without the pressure of a formal meeting. The goal wasn't to argue, it was to let her talk herself into admitting the truth. The opportunity came faster than I expected. That Saturday morning I spotted her at the small local grocery store, standing near the deli counter in her oversized sunglasses like she was hiding from paparazzi. I slipped the recorder into my jacket pocket, hit the button and walked right over. She saw me coming and immediately straightened up. "Mike," she said, her tone flat. "Sandra," I replied with a polite nod. "Heard about the board vote next week, tough spot, huh?" Her jaw tightened. "It's politics. People get emotional. They'll calm down." "Maybe," I said. "But from what I hear, a lot of folks are questioning the whole gatehouse situation now that they know the county side." That was all it took. She launched into a rant, half whispering but fast, like she had to get it off her chest. "They don't understand, Mike. I had to do something about that gate. If I'd let you build it, people would think the HOA was weak. I knew it wasn't technically illegal, but sometimes you have to push the rules to protect the community image." I kept my face neutral even though inside I was practically fist-pumping. "So you admit you knew it was legal?" I asked gently. "I didn't have proof it wasn't," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Look, tearing it down wasn't personal. It was about setting an example. And maybe I went about it the wrong way, but if I hadn't, you'd have walked all over the HOA." "Oh, so you did order it torn down?" I asked, keeping my voice casual. Her eyes narrowed like she just realized she'd said too much. "I oversaw it. I didn't do it myself." "Got it," I said, nodding. "Appreciate the honesty." By the time I walked out of that store, I had a 14-minute recording of Sandra admitting she knew my gatehouse was legal, admitting she ordered it taken down anyway, and admitting it was all to set an example. I didn't need to yell or make threats. I just emailed the audio file to 3 people, Bill Evans, Mark from down the road, and a neighbor named Sheila who had been fined $150 for excessive seasonal decorations one Christmas. I knew the neighborhood grapevine would handle the rest. The board vote was scheduled for Thursday night. I showed up early partly because I wanted a good seat, partly because I wanted to see Sandra walk in knowing what was coming. The room was packed again, but this time the energy was different. People weren't just murmuring, they were openly confronting her before the meeting even started. "Is it true you knew the gate was legal?" one man asked loudly. "Did you really say you had to set an example?" someone else demanded. Sandra kept repeating, "That's taken out of context," but nobody was buying it. When the meeting officially began, the first order of business was President's remarks. Sandra started to launch into a defense speech, but Sheila stood up mid-sentence. "With all due respect, we've heard your remarks," Sheila said. "I think the board, and this community, needs to hear something else instead." She pulled out her phone, hit play, and let Sandra's own voice fill the room. "I knew it wasn't technically illegal. Sometimes you have to push the rules to protect the community image. Tearing it down wasn't personal. It was about setting an example." The room went dead silent except for Sandra's voice echoing through the lodge. When it ended, there was a beat of silence. Then someone started clapping. Then another. And another. Sandra's face was the color of a stop sign. The board vote happened right after that. It wasn't even close. 35 votes to remove her. 3 votes to keep her. When the final count was read aloud, she grabbed her purse, muttered something under her breath, and stormed out without even collecting the rest of her papers. She didn't look at me as she passed, but I caught the quick, sharp sound of her heels on the floor like little gunshots. By the end of the week, the HOA had a new president, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Helen, who actually cared about the residents. One of her first acts? Removing most of the petty fines and opening up dialogue with homeowners. But here's the kicker. Even with Sandra gone, I still had control of the gate and the dock access. The new board decided it was easier to work with me than against me, which meant my $35,000 investment had turned into permanent leverage. And yet, I wasn't entirely satisfied. Because there was still one final move I could make. Something that would make sure the HOA never messed with me, my cabin, or my property again. It would be expensive. It would be dramatic. And it would leave my mark on Harbor Lake forever. With Sandra gone and Helen now leading the HOA, you might think I'd be ready to hang up my gloves and enjoy the victory. Nope. Because the truth was, while Helen was level-headed and reasonable, HOA boards change. Presidents come and go, and all it would take is one new Sandra type stepping in years from now to try and start this nonsense all over again. I wasn't going to let that happen. I wanted a permanent reminder to every current and future HOA board member that messing with me was a mistake they'd regret. Something they couldn't erase, couldn't find me over, and couldn't reverse without the whole neighborhood knowing. That's when the idea hit me. One last, dramatic, expensive move. It started with a conversation with Tom one lazy Sunday afternoon. We were sitting on my porch, beers in hand, watching the sun dip toward the tree line when I said, "What if I built something big?" He raised an eyebrow. Bigger than the gate? Much bigger. Something they'll have to drive by every single day. Something that screams, "Mike Harper isn't going anywhere." Tom grinned. "I like where this is going." The plan was outrageous. A custom-built two-story boathouse and observation deck, right on my leased dock access land. The structure would serve two purposes. First, it would be my own private lake retreat with storage for my boat and kayaks. Second, it would be visible from half the houses on the lake. Every time someone looked out their window, they'd see it standing there like a monument to my victory. And yes, I checked. Completely legal under my lease agreement, as long as it didn't block emergency access. I contacted a local construction crew I trusted, handed them my design and told them, spare no expense. Make it gorgeous, make it solid, and make it last. The cost, $23,000, on top of the $35,000 I'd already spent in this whole war, worth every penny. When the first loads of lumber arrived, the whispers started immediately. People slowed their cars to stare. The framework went up fast, tall beams rising against the sky. By the end of week 2, you could see the outline of the second-story deck with a wide staircase leading up from the dock. The crew worked with precision, and I made sure they had fresh coffee and snacks every morning to keep morale high. I wasn't just building a boathouse, I was building a statement. One afternoon, while the crew was installing the deck railings, Helen, the new HOA president, came by. She looked impressed. "Mike, I'm not here to give you trouble," she said with a smile. "Just wanted to say it's beautiful, and I think it's going to bring more good to the community than bad." That was a refreshing change from Sandra's constant hostility. I chuckled. "Thanks, Helen. As long as nobody tries to tell me to paint it beige, we'll get along fine." By the time it was finished, the boathouse looked like something out of a glossy lakefront magazine. Natural cedar siding, a wide covered area for my boat, built-in benches along the dock, and the crown jewel, a furnished second-story deck with panoramic views of the lake. I hosted my first gathering there the very next weekend. Just a handful of friends and neighbors, but word spread quickly. People who had once been neutral or even skeptical about me were now seeing the benefits. After all, I let them come up for a drink and enjoy the view. And the best part? Sandra had to drive past it any time she visited her old friends in the neighborhood. But here's the kicker. This project had an unexpected side effect I hadn't even planned for. Because I'd upgraded the dock area so much, several homeowners who weren't even part of the HOA started asking if they could rent space for their own boats. At first I said no. Then I realized, why not? So I started charging a modest monthly fee for boat slips. Within a month I was pulling in enough to cover my property taxes for the entire year, just from that dock. The HOA couldn't touch it. The county backed me up, and the residents who rented from me were thrilled. By late summer, Harbor Lake felt different. The tension that had once hung over the neighborhood like a storm cloud was gone, replaced with an unspoken understanding. Mike Harper had fought the HOA and won, not just once, not just in court, but in a way that left a permanent mark on the community's landscape. Still, there was one last bit of business, my personal finale. I commissioned a small brass plaque for the entrance gate, mounted just below the Welcome to Harbor Lake sign. It read, "This property stands as a reminder. Stand your ground. Respect your neighbors. No names, no dates. Just a quiet message to anyone who might think about pulling another Sandra stunt in the future." Tom came over the day it was installed. He stood there reading it, nodding slowly. "You know," he said, "if Sandra had just left your mailbox alone, none of this would have happened." I grinned. Yeah. But then we wouldn't have had nearly as much fun. By the time fall rolled around, I was spending more time on my deck than inside my cabin. Fishing in the mornings, grilling in the evenings, waving to neighbors who passed by. I had my peace back. And more than that, I had made sure no one could take it from me again. But Harbor Lake wasn't done surprising me yet. Because just when I thought the war was over, something happened that pulled me right back into HOA politics. Only this time, the new president was the one asking for my help. It was early spring, about 6 months after the boathouse was completed, when I heard a knock at my cabin door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I figured it might be Tom or maybe a delivery. But when I opened the door, there stood Helen, the new HOA president, looking, well, frazzled. She clutched a folder to her chest like it was a life raft. "Mike," she said, "I need your help." I'll admit, my first thought was that this was some kind of setup. Old habits die hard when you've been through HOA warfare. "What kind of help?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "It's bad," she said. "Worse than anything Sandra ever pulled. And honestly, you're the only one who can fix it." That got my attention. I stepped aside, motioning her in. She took a seat at my kitchen table and opened the folder. Inside were printouts, photos, and letters from county offices. Turns out, the HOA had a new problem, a big one. While Helen was cleaning up the financial mess left behind by Sandra, she discovered that the HOA's annual insurance policy for community property had lapsed 3 months ago. And in that time, a storm had damaged part of the shoreline retaining wall near the lake's public swimming area. The repair bill? $42,000. The HOA's reserve fund? Just over $10,000. They couldn't afford the fix, and if they didn't do it soon, the county was threatening to shut down the entire swimming area and fine them heavily for safety violations. "So why come to me?" I asked, though I was starting to guess the answer. Helen hesitated, then said, "Because the damaged section is connected to your leased strip of land by the dock. You already have the equipment, the crew contacts, and the access. If you took on the project, the county would approve it faster. And frankly, we'd rather deal with you than go through months of permit battles." I leaned back, studying her. "You realize the irony, right? Less than a year ago, your HOA sued me over a mailbox. Now you want me to save you from a county shutdown." She actually smiled a little. "Yeah, ironic, but here we are." I didn't say yes immediately. Part of me wanted to tell them to clean up their own mess. But another part, call it the strategic side, saw an opportunity. "I'll do it," I said slowly, "but on 2 conditions. 1, the HOA pays me a reasonable lease fee for any future use of my land, no matter who's in charge. That goes into a written agreement filed with the county." "Done," she said without hesitation. "And 2, I continued, you permanently drop the HOA's authority over my property and any property I lease in the future. No violations, no fines, no approval needed. Ever." Helen didn't even blink. "Also done." Within a week, I had my crew out there working on the wall. We replaced the damaged section with reinforced concrete, added extra drainage, and even put in a new handrail for good measure. The county inspector signed off on it in record time. The swimming area reopened before summer, and the HOA avoided the massive fines they were facing. And me? I walked away with a formal recorded agreement that guaranteed the HOA could never touch me, or anything I built, again. The change in how people treated me was almost comical. Neighbors who once gave me side-eye now waved when they drove by. People started stopping at my gate to chat about fishing, the weather, or just to say thanks. Even folks who had been loyal to Sandra before were admitting, quietly, that I'd done more for the neighborhood in a year than the HOA had in the past decade. The new agreement also meant that my boathouse, the gate, and even the dock rental business were untouchable. They were mine, permanently. One warm July evening, I was sitting on the top deck of the boathouse with Tom, watching the sunset over the lake. The air smelled like grilled burgers from a nearby barbecue, and the water was calm, reflecting the orange glow of the sky. "You know," Tom said, "this all started over a $500 mailbox." I laughed. "Yeah, and it ended with me owning the front door, the dock, and the lake view." He raised his beer. "To Sandra, may she forever regret messing with the wrong neighbor." We clinked bottles, and I leaned back in my chair, the warm breeze on my face, feeling like the king of Harbor Lake. I hadn't just gotten revenge. I'd built something lasting, something no petty HOA politics could ever take away. And I'll tell you this. If anyone ever tries, well, I've got the blueprint ready. Where are you watching from? Because if you've ever had to deal with a controlling HOA, you know exactly how good this feels. And maybe, just maybe, you're getting ideas of your own.